Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. Absolute pleasure today to be starting off a new series of supply chain and logistics book reviews that we're running. And this will run every 2 or 3 weeks. We'll be bringing out a new author, a new reviewer for new books. And some of these are some of the most keystone books in the logistics and supply chain world. An absolute pleasure today and appropriate that I be introducing a prolific author, a doctor, professor, and not only a leading consultant globally, but a mentor to many, including myself over the last 20 odd years, Dr. John Gattorna. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Kim, and that make me sound too old. You're still a very young man.
Yes, I don't think you're too much older than I am, but certainly you've been a leading light right across supply chain from your days back at Accenture. You've formed a lot of theory and practice right across the global landscape of logistics in supply chain. You've consulted to many, if not most, of the large supply chain companies globally, both from the client side and manufacturing, consumer products, FMCG, pharma, industrial, ports, shipping, aviation, but also throughout the professional world from the academic side as well. So, John, without further ado, I mean, you've written more books than I personally know of anybody else in writing in the supply chain world. And we're going to feature a couple of books today. One you wrote with Deb Ellis,
dear that's the last one
of yours, and I know Deb very well, Transforming Supply Chains. And also a book, I have copies of all of your books, all about 10 or 15 of them. In 2015, you wrote Dynamic Supply Chains, which I have here. So let's kick off with the book that you want to review first, and then we'll perhaps talk about the second one after that.
Well, thanks, Kim. Well, that Dynamic Supply Chains was actually the third book or the third edition in a series, which I started in 2006. In 2006, I wanted to write down on paper for posterity, all the things I'd learned over the previous 20 years, but I'd never had time to write down. And in fact, the very first of those 3 books, leading to the one we want to talk about today, we actually call Living Supply Chains, which my publisher in London, FD Publishing, I thought they were the ones that came up with the name, and it's sort of got a red cabbage with big veins and things and channels on the front, and I thought it was brilliant. But I think we're the only 2 people in the world who thought it was brilliant, because in 2006, when we went and did a book tour in the US with some of the biggest names in the US and corporations, they looked at me and said, well, John, what are you talking about living? What's living got to do with supply chains? And at that point, I knew I had a problem. And because as you know, my whole thrust has been, even though I'm an engineer, I've been trying to get people to understand that supply chains are actually driven by people and their behavior. Whether you're a customer or a supplier or you work in a business, there's lots of decisions going on and judgments being made. Now, at that stage in 2006, the Americans, at least, thinking technology will save us. Well, when the publisher heard about this, they lost the plot a bit, and they said, oh, we can't use that name. We'll have to go and call it Dynamic Supply Chain. So the second edition that we came out with, which is the one before we're going to talk about today, was dynamic, replacing the word living, which is not a bad word, but it doesn't quite get the point that I was trying to make. And progressively, I added content, because we started with a concept in 89 called alignment. And the idea of alignment was that if you want to run a business, including your supply chains, you've got to line 4 things up. You've got to understand your customers' expectations. You've got to respond appropriately. You've got to go inside the business and develop subcultures to underpin these different operational thrusts. And you've got to have a leadership style that will it's got a bandwidth that will allow you to drive these multiple supply chains. And so we went through a couple of iterations, 2010, then we got to the 2015. And I'll tell you a funny story about that one, because the editor at the time, she made the mistake of taking a sort of 6-month sabbatical, and she went off to Africa somewhere to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. And when she came back, I'd been beavering away, and the book had got out of control. You know, I don't know how many pages, but you know, there's 600 and odd pages in here, and she just about blew a gasket on that and said, "Well, what are we going to do?" And I said, "Well, I'm not backing out. We need this content," because, you know, I'd put in stuff about the supply base and organisation design, things that we hadn't had in previous books or you won't find in other books. Yeah. So she compromised by saying, well, what we'll do, we'll thin down the pages and we'll make the print a bit smaller so we can fit it all in. But it's quite a tome. So
that book becomes more of a text for the professional manager in supply chain.
Yeah,
not.
This is the sort of it's a sort of book, a reference book you dip into for the really technical guy, because there's a chapter on all the different 5 types of supply chain. You know, the collaborative supply chain, the lean supply chain, the campaign supply chain. And there's a lot of depth in it, and you know, you could just spend a whole lot of time just studying about the campaign supply chain.
Well, I think that's true, and you know, one of the things I find so readable about your books, and you know, as I say, we used to get cartons of them, if you remember, and give them away as gifts at Christmas time and what have you, and we still have some. You know,
probably out there somewhere. Yeah.
They're everywhere. I mean, we're talking hundreds and hundreds of them, and they're always gratefully accepted, I can assure you. We had our own banner on them and what have you. But I know I've still got a couple of cases back in Sydney. I haven't been able to get back to Sydney for a couple of years, of course, due to the pandemic. But one of the things I like about your books is there's always case studies, real cases. Yep. So you must have done a lot of arm twisting for a lot of tier 1 clients globally that I know that you've consulted to and continue to do so worldwide, all over every continent, because I've run into you in about 5 continents during conferences. So the case studies, how do you actually get clients to agree to because the information you get is granular and a lot of it quite confidential, but you manage to convince them to let you put it on paper. How's that?
Look, you know, all our stuff is, you know, in a sense, case studies, because that's the only way you learn, Kim. I mean, I a long time ago came to the view that we needed to get in depth inside an organisation over a period of time to become our laboratories. The thing is that if you take someone like a Schneider Electric, and we've been working with them, you know, off and on for 8, 9, 10 years, the whole digital journey, the whole global supply chain journey, it gets to a stage where they're so far ahead that they don't mind us having a case study, which doesn't give away all the secrets anyhow, but it still makes the point. And we've got better and better at this. I mean, we had some short, sharp ones in this book, but in the latest book, 2020, we decided we'd try and do them in a sort of almost a 1-page format, because we want people to, and we sort of use the Minto approach. You know, what's the situation they're in? What was the worst thing about that situation? You know, what were the alternatives and what were the results? And the idea was to have a 1-page case study at the end of each chapter to really demonstrate what we were talking about. Yep. Now, the big difference between this book and the latest one in 2020 was that we hadn't quite got into the digital age in 2015, if you remember. You know, e-commerce was with us, but you know, nowhere near at the level now.
Massive transformation.
No, none of that. And 2 things actually happened when we were running our global retreats. As you know, we've run them in all sorts of places like Hamburg and Amsterdam and Cape Town and everywhere. We were getting, this was our research. We had groups of people, 30, 40 really top executives, starting to talk in 2017, 18 about, gee, we've got to start transforming our business. We're falling behind. We're still on Excel spreadsheets. You know, decision-making time is too long. And that's when we picked up this idea that transforming supply chains. We decided, and we wrote that during 18 and 19. And the big difference between the previous book is that about half of it is digital. You know, we caught up on all the digital stuff, digitalization, how important it was. You know, the absolute critical importance of establishing control towers for real-time monitoring of the way orders are progressing towards your customer. And of course, that brought us into blockchain and everything else. So we pretty much caught up. And look, it's only a year since that book was published, and I could probably write another book tomorrow with the way that the digitalization has progressed and the speed which is going on.
Yeah. Look, the other thing, John, that that's, your books are evolutionary. They're revolutionary and they're evolutionary. They're revolutionary because you've actually established benchmarking of so much terminology in supply chain. Yeah. It's crazy over the last 20 years. So kudos for that. And you also have a very successful formula on some books. And as we're talking, I'm just going to whip onto the screen, but my production manager says, don't ever do that, Kim. It's not a good look. So I'll stop. And she's not actually here at the moment. She's in Jamaica on holiday. So I'm running solo. But the point is, you managed to get a lot of subject matter experts around the world and one book in particular, and must tell me which one it is, because I'd like to get a review from you on that down track in our series, not today. But it's the one where you got about 20 of us to give you a chapter on particular. You gave the chapters, you gave some very clear writing instructions, which I found onerous and hardcore, but you beat me up until I got the chapter done. What book was that?
That was called Dynamic Supply Chain Alignment, 2009, and it was with myself and with friends, and all the friends, including yourself, were in here, and there are about 28 chapters, and you all contributed to it, and it was around that whole alignment theme, and you can see the cover there, the Canadian geese sort of flying in formation, creating that alignment phenomena. Yeah, so we can talk about that because that's got so many different subjects in it, chapter by chapter. Well, we can do that some other time.
Absolutely, and much of what you have managed to get into that book, again, classic cases, so much learning. And actually the work that has to go in to, I thought it was going to take me 3 weeks. It took me 3 or 4 months.
That's right, yeah.
And as I recall, it was, you wanted to know the case of what we did in the tsunami when we got deployed by the World Economic Forum into Sri Lanka for the tsunami relief project and operation. And the amount of referencing that has to go in, and the amount of judicious assessment and making sure that no laws are broken or copyrights or anything like or plagiarism is incredible.
That's right.
What are you working on at the moment, John? As everybody can see, we've put a list of all the books we're talking about today and how they can contact to acquire the books or to contact you to get further information. What's going on at the moment with you and Deb? I know works very closely with you and Sydney there.
The thing with us right now is that the 220 book was literally published in early 2020, just before the whole COVID crisis, as it were. So there's nothing in there about that. But, we've got enough material now for another book, which we could follow up on this, because what we've discovered, Kim, is that we're going forward into a world where I'll call it where we're going to be managing in a parallel universe. We're still going to have business as usual, but business as usual is still going to be a lot of volatility involved, plus or minus 40% of demand and supply patterns. But on top of that, we're now recognizing, I'll give you a picture, is that every now and again you're going to get this big blip, this black swan event. And in a sense, it's the commercial side of what we talked about with your humanitarian logistics. The idea that every now and again we'll have some major disruption caused by either a volcano or a tsunami or by a virus or something which affects a region of the world, or in this case, the latest case, the whole globe. And whereas back in 2015, we were talking around about, when we talked about humanitarian supply chains, we were saying, well, maybe you should get a few people part-time to look at this and be ready to step in when there's an emergency. I think those days are gone. I think that for billion-dollar type companies, we have to have dedicated people in teams looking at scenarios, like the SAS is always doing, thinking about scenarios, potential scenarios of the future, and having people ready to run with models when something happens. Yeah. It's too late when you start working on this after it's hit. And, the interesting thing is that in the current crisis, we had people from South Africa contacting us. They were the biggest producer of blueberries. Now they make they send a lot of blueberries to European supermarkets, but they said our forecasting's out the window. We got no idea what they're going to buy this year or what the hell. And we said, well, if you'd had a ready to run model, you could forget about all your forecasting techniques. You could run different scenarios and make a judgment about what you want to do in terms of the supply side. So it's really we're really talking about a two-speed approach to is the fast approach to the normal business as usual and the very fast approach. And that's what we want to write about in our next version of Transforming Supply Chains.
So the new normal, there is no normal.
There is no normal.
Everything's new. And,
the new next normal, yeah.
The next
that's
normal.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah. So terminology such as cross-docking, we've talked about traditionally goods. It's now about cross-docking strategy. It's about cross-docking so in the gate and back out again and moving as quickly as possible.
Exactly.
And JIT, we're going back around the circle to JIT, just-in-time terminology and strategy and execution. Everything's got to be JIT these days, yeah?
Everything. And, the word that's come out of this whole COVID crisis, as you know, is resilience. If you've heard that 100 times, you've heard it 1,000 times. But there are so many moving parts to make a big company resilient. And a lot of it is just down to straight decision making. How can we hire the right people, the right talent who are prepared to take calculated risks and make quick decisions rather than have call a committee meeting, those sorts of things at the human end. And of course, you've got to have your network in good shape. You want to have looked at your network and thought, what's the quickest way? We don't want these long lead times anymore, these long supply chains. We want regional supply points. We want quick manufacturing, 3D printing is going to happen locally. It's the possibilities are endless. It just makes the field so wonderful, such a rich feel from what used to be a pretty boring operational field, Kim.
Totally, and I guess that segues into the fact that I've got a new title for your next book. It's Supply Chain Explodes.
Okay, well that's good. I might take that.
Because if we could have seen 2 years ago the way that logistics and supply chain as professions and as infrastructural parts of economies, whatever, have come into the spotlight under the pandemic. I mean, we're not looking for silver linings here, but the reality is that both from a consulting perspective with your business, our business, and hundreds and thousands of others who are involved in the industry globally, things have just gone off the hook. Talent acquisition and identification, the recruitment side of our business is having the strongest year in 22 years. And it's all because companies and countries and governments are understanding the vital need for efficient supply chains. It's never been under the spotlight the way it has currently.
No, I mean, the governments have had a real wake-up call, and you look at the Australian government, they completely caught out with the PPE shortages and other and more recently, the shortages of vaccines. Trying to be, clever and hold back, and whilst we were not getting much COVID infection, we were all sort of getting lulled into a false sense of security. And suddenly, when we get the second and third wave and the Delta, and we want the vaccines, of course, we haven't ordered them because everyone else in the world. So I think governments had a wake-up call. Major corporations have. And a lot of it's about digital now, of course, but it's about making good judgments and having good leadership. And, I think that you're in a great position because, there's many young people now who now see this field as a really interesting patchwork quilt type of field to get into as a career rather than, I'm going to be a warehouseman, and that's nothing wrong with that. But in the early days, 20, 30 years ago, there wasn't much beyond that. Or a truck driver. Yeah,
absolutely. And we've been forced by public demand or consumer demand to create market entry programs for people wanting to get into logistics and supply chain. Yes. I mean, the way consumer patterns have changed, e-commerce, home delivery for everything has pushed everybody into the idea that, hey, this is an industry that's got a lot of future in it. So whilst, of course, we know there are a lot of industries that have taken a big hit, at least logistics and supply chain can suck up a lot of those people. And
well, it's pervasive, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the fascinating thing with this absolute explosion of e-commerce at the consumer level, that's spilling over now into industrial. So you've got industrial companies now that 5 years ago were happy to order something and wait for 3 months. They want it in 3 weeks or 3 days now. So the expectations have gone up so that the old bricks and mortar big brand type industrial companies are really having to change the game and lift their game to bring it up to somewhere where electronic, high tech, and FMCG is, which is just amazing. You never would have thought that would happen, but and that opens up incredible opportunities for people, going into roles.
John, always absolutely enlightening and stimulating talking to you, my friend, and want to get you back because you do
anytime.
You have so many other books. Today we featured, and everybody can see down here below, Transforming Supply Chains with Deb Ellis, the dear Deb Ellis, and also Dynamic Supply Chains, 3rd edition, which we talked about today. We'll feature those. I'll also put Living Supply Chains that you can see down below now.
That was part of the history, yeah.
That's part of the early days, and want to get back and talk about the latest book as well soon. So we'll be definitely getting you back.
Right.
Thanks again for taking the time, John. I know it's getting on to the end of your day. To all of our listeners, we hope that meeting with Dr. John Gattorna today has given you some insight, some inspiration about what you can find in terms of content to learn more about the industry for those who don't, and for those who do, always some reminders and some insights into new strategies and what have you that John brings, especially with those case studies. To everybody who's keeping us safe out there, as always, respect to everybody in the front line, everybody in enforcement, everybody in the financial sector, really trying to keep things stable in many of the countries, to all of the first responders, everybody in healthcare. Thank you so much. Take care. Everybody in supply chain, keep trucking, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks again, John.
My pleasure, Kim, and any time at all.